Hi, everybody. My name is Danny from Lyra Bristol Poetry Festival. Welcome to this event as part of the Here and There project with Ake Arts and Book Festival, Bristol Ideas, and Toronto International Festival of Authors. 2022 marks the centenary of the first publication of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, one of the most influential poems of the 20th century. It, alongside other great works of art and literature from that year, ushered in a new age of modernism. Both Lyra Festival and Bristol Ideas have been marking this anniversary throughout the year. The Wasteland was written out of Eliot's despair, both his personal turmoil and what he saw as Europe's post-war fears of cultural collapse following the destruction of the First World War. The relevance of The Wasteland today is clear. Eliot's work was published 3 years after the start of the Spanish flu pandemic, and the world now has faced many crises since 2008, including financial, health, Brexit, growing inequality, polarization, a crisis of democracy, war, and hanging over all of it, climate change and a new wasteland with the destruction of biodiversity and a world burning. Together, Ake Arts and Book Festival in Nigeria, Bristol Ideas in the UK, Toronto International Festival of Authors in Canada have commissioned new poems responding to the wasteland. 12 poets, 4 from each Canada, UK, and Nigeria, were commissioned to write new pieces, which are being published online in a zine, which you can find at bristolideas.co.uk. Myself and Dr. Lucy English from Lyra Festival chose 4 poets from the UK, 2 Canadian-born British poets, Alicia Peer Mohammed and J.R. Carpenter, and 2 British-Nigerian poets, Boyega Odubanjo and Yomi Sode. And Yomi joins us now for a special poem performance, a reading of People Watching.
Awesome. People watching. And what would you like me to say? That I saw both of them walking towards the ticket barrier? I did. The one in front holding a maroon briefcase that complemented the stripes in his navy blue suit and shoes. He looked important. The one behind, disheveled and fidgety, his trousers slumping a little at the back. I also saw him, and while close enough to the man in front, he held a distance. I heard the man in front. We all heard him. Were you trying to sneak in behind me? This routine wasn't new for the guy behind. Barriers take up to 3 seconds to close. Your average commuter is through in 1 unless there's a problem. Today, there was a problem. Boss, I don't want trouble. I just don't have money. So I thought, boss, you thought what? That I was your fast track to a free ride? What would you want me to say? That regardless of other commuters telling the guy in front to relax, asking that he considered this man's desperation, knowing Monday mornings in winter, especially after the 2 years we've all been through, are never easy. Should he show empathy? For that to happen, we would have to question empathy. Question the courts when the mothers plead to keep their child alive. Question the dictators when civilians are woken up at night to the sounds of missiles raining down like hailstones. Question the government celebrating while others are fined for wanting to lay their loved ones to rest. What would you want me to say? That I was surprised the man in front punched the man in the face, the one behind. Like all this anger in our bodies hadn't been looking for a way out since it was locked in. The man behind now having to bear the brunt. Am I surprised that one felt more superior to the other? No. Do I think this speaks for the world I'm living in now? Yes. Was I surprised when other commuters came to the injured man's aid? A little. I witnessed many an outcry from people globally go unheard. Scroungers, the lot of you. And that's the thing about suits. You tend to hide your demons well. I almost saw the care, the galvanizing for one, and all it took was one to make his decision to ruin it all. Later, when the police arrived, it wasn't the suit they stopped first. The story goes, The man in front worked hard to ensure he had enough money to travel, not for others to freeload. So the man in front felt away. Scroungers, the lot of you. Words spat out in defense. The man behind, his face now swollen, never meant to offend. The story goes, he lost his travel money and was desperate to see his child. What more would you want me to say? That I stood back and watched, thinking of the world right now. I did. I knew how this would unfold. The lack of understanding and disorder. Living in these times, you don't need a superpower to predict the future. You just need sterile strips for the wounds heading your way. So, what was it you asked about empathy?
So, Yomi Sode, thank you so much for reading your poem, People Watching. How you doing today? You okay?
I'm good, I'm good. How you keeping? You all right?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Really nice to hear you actually read the poem because I've read it a few times and you just hear so much music and so much tone, and I get so much out of it. So I've got quite a few questions to ask, kind of about your process, the themes of the poem, just the approach you took, and I think we'll start there. I'd love to know about how you approached this commission and whether you were responding to the wasteland as a whole or whether you were looking at any specific sections.
I think in thank you first and foremost for the invitation to even look into this response. I'm just like, how do you respond to such a piece of work that's influenced so many writers and is landmark in its celebration. And I guess that was the first thing for me was, do I want to write a response to this in individual kind of settings, or do I do I swallow the kind of like challenge of this entire piece? And I think the feel that I got from just these individual sections that read as a whole was just in relation to how I write, was the social commentary. um how do I kind of look into a mundane kind of situation, but that speaks to a grander thing, a bigger worry, a bigger kind of conflict, and it speaks for the where we are at now in society, and how we look into situations, how we deal with situations. And my job as the writer was just to kind of look at that, because that's what I believe was happening in the wasteland. Was we were met with all of these different observations, some of which might not necessarily make sense in the first instance, but it just seemed like a stream of consciousness that in its own way, it spoke for the time
Yeah,
that that currently those, the community of people the writer was living in. Do you know what I mean? And I think for me, that was my approach, was how do I speak to something that speaks to the now, without trying to replicate the wasteland in terms of those passages and those poems.
definitely. No, and that definitely comes across to me. One of my questions was literally going to be that your approach is really contemporary in both in terms of the setting of this train station ticket barrier. It's super located in like the now and us and our community, um but also it's got this kind of prose poem like form and like real playfulness, like the striking out of a line, the way it tells and unfolds a story. So in terms of responding to such a famous poem written like an entire century ago, trying to form a modern response, was that also at the heart of it, both the location and the way it's presented?
Yes. The location for me is almost like, how do you make something so simple big? And for me, I think tension can rise from anything. It can be from the biggest situation or the smallest. And I'm just like, let's just look into this small situation between two individuals. Both of those individuals have things going on in their lives, but universally, we've just all experienced a pandemic. So there's almost like post trauma and there's post feelings, there's post trauma, there's all these different things that are happening post the heavy period of a pandemic that we still carry, but we've not had any outlet in terms of vent. Some people have taken, they've They've done therapy online. Do you see what I mean? Some because they haven't been able to kind of visit the therapist or to do that on a face-to-face. Some haven't even gone into any form of therapy to have someone to talk to. Some people have been living alone. So you carry all of that. And at any given point, it it can explode or implode depending on what the situation is. And this situation happens to be at a train station, ticket barrier, boom, and we're met with this instant tension that now involves everybody in a space, that now involves the pandemic, goes into empathy. But to question empathy, we need to look at how people have been responding in society as a whole. We now have to question the morale of people and the kindness of people, and it just absolutely goes. And I think I can't think of a better way in to question the human side of people, especially the eye that's watching everything unfold. Because what part does that person play?
Mm.
Because that was the interesting one for me.
Yeah, I love that. And this I've got a question later, kind of about that sort of unreliable narrator, I suppose, but behind this piece of writing. Um, but I love that idea of the things you've taken to link that poem to your response is the collective trauma. Of course, for Eliot, it would have been post-war trauma,
Yep.
something everybody had not, most people wouldn't have experienced unless they were a lot older. And then for us, that sort of post-pandemic, but also the morality of the individual characters. So in terms of the setting of people watching this everyday scenario, there's obviously these like, it's super located and super general in a sense, but then there's all these underlying tensions, class issues, wider societal contexts that just become more and more pertinent as the poem unfolds. And there is, I feel, this really cool tension between the wider world, like there's reference to dictators and missiles and what the speaker's thinking about. And then, for example, we get, and I quote, "I've witnessed many an outcry from people globally go unheard. Scroungers, the lot of you." And that's the thing about suits. They tend to hide your demons well. And I love that because it goes from this idea of global outcry straight back into this very Daily Mail Britain idea of scroungers, this kind of term we've all heard.
Mm.
So with this particular setting, how do you feel like it works as a microcosm for something much more global?
I can go to my local train station now, and you can there's still class issues potentially in the people that I'm sat next to on a train. Do you see what I mean? Um, you know, someone in a suit for the most part might seem the most put together person, but really and truly is chaos going on inside, as we witnessed in the poem. Just because you're looking the part and ready for your day doesn't mean you have it all going on. Doesn't mean that you're well settled in what's happening. Just because someone looks so ruffled and rough and whatever it is, doesn't mean that they are the poorest person going on. Do you see what I mean? You don't know. You can't work these things out. We can't just go by these kind of judgments from the outside to be like we know what you are like internally. And
Yeah.
for me, I wanted to explore that. You walk on the streets, you don't know who you're passing on a day-to-day basis, you don't know where they might be at mentally, and there's always a potential for tension to kick off. And what do we need to rely on in terms of kindness in order for that to not happen, right? But it's very hard to now ask for kindness when, as a society, we're hit with the cost of living crisis, we're hit with Brexit, we're hit with a changing of parliament, three within 1 year. Like we're going through so much in terms of health service, and it's hard to call for kindness in ourselves when the world we're living in, where the society we're living in is not being kind to us living within it. So it's hard for me to try to be like, have a nice day, when I've just been hit with a gas bill that I now have to think about how I need to pay for it, and I wasn't expecting to pay for it. Don't come to me with have a nice day. I still have to deal with this stuff. Do you see what I mean? So it speaks to a wider issue, and it's like, how can we effectively work on empathy when the land that we're living in currently, they're not empathizing with the people living within it to be kind. And the suits, they're just partying their lives away for the most part, to just make sure that their pockets stay fatter. And while kids in schools are not being fed, which is crazy to me, you know? So that's why I said, you know, suits and demons, there's certain things that's been asked of us as human beings, but it's difficult when we feel the pressure that of what's been kind of put upon us. But the expectation is for us to still live. The expectation is for us to still carry on as normal, and it's just not that simple.
Yeah, and that all of that is kind of blowing up in the background, right? Because if you're reading into the poem and underneath your words, a lot of those thoughts are there from the speaker. He's kind of an impartial, but not an impartial commentator on what's going on. But I love what you're saying about how all these wider societal issues are just kind of contained in these everyday moments, whether it's at the ticket barrier, sitting on the train, characters you encounter. And similarly to Eliot in The Wasteland, I feel like the so-called wasteland you're depicting is a social one. It's this social chaos and wasteland, and a psychological one. Like you mentioned, empathy, emotions of empathy, and things like entitlement seem to be in direct conflict. And so much of the tension of the poem is there. This archetype of the suited man. I mean, there's an inevitability about him almost. It's like he's a lost cause. And there's this inevitability of the situation. I think after the police arrive, you know, the speaker says, "I knew how this would unfold," and there's a certainty in that that isn't in a lot of the other things he says. And I think, yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about this state of wasteland that you wanted to depict? How you interpreted that idea?
And you know the interesting thing between the man in front and the man behind, the suited man, and the kind of like the rough kind of the rough, not so suited, not so kind of disheveled man, right? Both of them have a purpose, because both of them are they both of them are on a specific goal on that specific day, right? Even when the suited man, even when the suited man should be in a position to feel where he's wrong, the suited man doesn't feel wrong. The suited man is like, I pay my taxes, I go about life, you know, paying my rent, da 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 da. Why should I let this person in behind me? Right? I have no right. Even though he chose violence, he still feels like his position stands firm. The man behind is like, I'm not meaning to offend. I'm desperate to see my child. Right? This is my situation. So the man on right, the man behind doesn't necessarily, it feels like, oh, okay, cool. I don't mean to offend you. It wasn't necessarily that, you know, this was going to be a big deal. Show some grace, show some empathy, or whatever it is,
Yeah.
and that goes missing. So it's almost like both at no point in the poem did I feel the man in front, the suited man, needed to apologize, because there are many people who feel justified within their stance of, I pay my taxes, I do this, I do this. There's no need for this person to be trying to sneak in on an Oyster card that I've paid for, either monthly or yearly. This is where I stand. And I think as there are representatives of that suited man that are your next door neighbors, that are in parliament, that are in your workplace, that are in your art organizations. They feel that they stand strong in the decisions they make, right? And this is the world we're living in. Does that need to be challenged? Yes, it needs to be challenged. There are people like the guy behind who's desperate to see the sun, but does not have enough funds to do that. That person needs support. That person represents a good range of residents, a good range of a community that also need to be looked into when we're talking about social economic disparities. And that are living in houses that are weeks, years away from absolute destruction. You've got mold, you've got all these different things happening within there, and they've been living in those circumstances for years, and they need to be, and attention needs to be paid to them. But again, they're unmentioned. So I think it's good to kind of, for me, my aim was to just bring these to light and say, and say, this is inherently the wasteland that we're living in right now, where one person doesn't look to the other and show some care. Both of them are driven by their own specific purposes to a certain degree. And there are the people around that are trying to help. And there's the speaker who, for the most part, knows how this would unfold. When the police arrived, they did not arrive to tend to the man that is bleeding first. They
Yes.
did, but in a sense of thinking that that person caused the issue.
What's he done, sort of?
Was he done?
Yeah.
As opposed to looking at the person, as opposed to looking at it fairly and just being like, what happened? They made a decision as to where they were going to go first. And I think that for me is something that we also need to pay attention to in terms of enforcement and the biases when it comes to law enforcement, you know?
How it's literally because of how someone's dressed, how they appear, to tell us about like who was in the right or the wrong. And I find a really interesting thing, although the guy behind us committed the quote unquote crime, not paying for a ticket, we do have so much empathy, and we don't, with the guy in front, his actions seem far more wicked, and his way he talks, and this is before he throws the punch, which interestingly in the way you write it as well is kind of dropped in quite nonchalantly, just kind of dropping the fact that, oh, and he punched him. And I think it's like what you're saying is it's all the stuff underneath, and that makes him that person and makes him think that way. That is the focus, not the actual act of harm, but then the way the police come and respond to that and the way they assess that situation is very different and carries those biases.
Because we don't know what's driving the man in front. We don't know what's going on in his personal life.
Yeah.
See what I mean? It's what he done was totally off. What he done was wrong. With the way he's speaking to not only the other commuters or the other passers-by, but the person behind is also off. But we don't know what that person's going through off the back of a pandemic that collectively we all went through, right?
Yeah.
And what's the underlying thing, or what's over what is almost over all of that is a government that lied. Essentially a government that lied, a government that bent rules, a government that kept on, that wasn't sure on what they were doing, and it had its effect on a global majority. So it's almost like this kind of layering of pressure because there was no outlet for peace, essentially, right? So of course it's going to spew out in different ways.
100%. I love the approach. I love the approach to the poem, and again, that I'd love to ask about that question of how you approached empathy, right? Because you end the poem in a very interesting way. The poem is kind of has so many questions throughout, and the questions really develop, and you get this sense of the speakers also is searching for answers, or perhaps in some kind of interaction with the reader. And the ending of, so what was it you asked about empathy? When I was looking at the penultimate line of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which is Data Dayadvam Damyata, translates to give, show compassion, and control yourself. It got me wondering whether that was an intentional mirroring and why you ended on the word empathy as well.
So the whole piece, the narrator is almost being asked what happened, right? And then the narrator starts to break it down. But also what the narrator's trying to do is like, you know, what the narrator's also trying to speak and convey this whole thing of what else did you think was going to happen? Like what I could see how this was going to unfold, and I think for the most part there's some guilt also in the speaker, because the speaker could have done something, could have got involved in the same way that other passers-by were kind of like trying to slow things down. And for me, it's no different from people witnessing an accident or witnessing something on the ground or someone on the ground and they take their cameras out and they film it, as opposed to maybe calling the police or something, or calling the ambulance or something like that. You just watch it. And if you are like this kind of voyeuristic kind of looking at this situation, or you're not taking part in it, the way it ends is almost as a self-reflection to the speaker, to be like, how can you be asking? Well, for me to talk about empathy, I have to consider what empathy is, and I don't know if if any empathy was shown from myself in relation to this situation, because I just decided it was a decision to just watch what was going to happen. It's a
Yeah,
decision in watching what was going to happen, because they knew how it was going to unfold, and they decided to just not do anything about it. So it's almost like they feel complicit in the escalation of that happening.
absolutely love that. I hadn't fully thought of it in that way either, so it's really good to hear that. That makes it make a lot of sense, and why you set it out that way, and why the questions appear throughout the poem as well. Yeah, brilliant. I love the unreliable narrator and the way it's presented, and this ending. I know I hate saying the words like solution, because yeah, poets aren't trying to do that, and often can't do that. And I think asking a question is often, as useful as providing an answer. But is there some kind of thing of empathy being some kind of antidote to a lot of these issues that run through the poem and are
I
implied?
I think I wanted it to jar. I wanted it to jar because just on a day-to-day living this world is jarring. It's it's annoying. It's what do you want me to ask about empathy? Like
Yeah,
the passers-by, the people, they try to show empathy, to try to convey it to the suit guy, the guy in front, to be like, just care for this guy, just think about him. He ended up punching him anyway.
yeah,
We tried. We tried to show empathy. There's no, it doesn't happen. It just didn't go the way we thought it would go. But that doesn't to say that empathy doesn't exist,
yeah.
because there was still a collective of people caring for this guy. It was just one person that decided not to go that way. And I think what the poem looks into the balance of how this works. In some cases, some people are going to absolutely feel empathy, and in some cases, some people are driven by their own goal, their own purpose, and this is what they're going to do. And then somewhere in between, you have to find yourself in there, because I think with the waistline, it's not necessarily trying to tell us how to live our. Yes, I think the waistline is trying to explore these different ways of how to look into life and how you go from there. But it's no instruction to be like, this is how you need to live your life. It's just, this is where we're at. This is what was happening. You now have to make sense of it somehow. And I think if there's anything I took from it, it was that. It was let me write this poem. And I'm not going to end it on a bad note or a sad note or a happy note. I'm just going to end it on a note that makes us consider how we enter the world going forward.
And that definitely comes across. I think just to end, one more question around the sort of the wider approach. The Wasteland is a poem everyone's come across. Every poet's come across, either they've read it or they've studied it at some point. Was it something you'd considered responding to before? So when you got this kind of brief through, what were your immediate feelings, and were there different directions you were considering, or was it like, I know what I'm doing?
Um, I've been aware of the wasteland. I think it's almost like in that it's in your poet's toolkit, right? To almost be in there. But also I represent a community of poets who or probably never heard of the poem.
Yeah,
Um and it doesn't make them less of a poet if they haven't read the wasteland. It's like to say that, every poet, every kind of every writer, everyone that's had some form of writing in them that wants to tell a story, they must know about Shakespeare or they must know about T.S. Eliot. And I'm just like, no, because I think that is almost like the trap to kind of bring you into this whole setting of like dead white men for the most part that you kind of need to know, right? And coming from my own background, I am more inclined to know of Nigerian poets, for example. early doors to be aware of that. It's not to necessarily say that T.S. Eliot or Shakespeare's or Wordsworth or all these people are secondary, but I have to consider my own landscape importantly, in order to not understand the wider landscape of how things work, you know. And I'm not disregarding the wasteland, but I'm also taking into consideration poets from my own background, from my own landscapes that were pushed to one side, so to speak, in the thoughts of maybe their work is not considered as high priority as a Shakespeare or as a T.S. Eliot. Do you see what I mean? So I would I would put both now in equal measure. And I think for me, at one point, I definitely was conditioned in a thought to feel like you need to know about Wasteland. You need to know about all these sonnets and plays of Shakespeare and all of these works of dead white men. And now I feel more in a comfortable state to be like, yes, I'm more than aware of these works, but I'm also aware of works within my own landscape that build my own literary canon, so to speak, that gives me a bigger and better sense of belonging and voice and power and knowledge. Do you see what I mean? So yeah, I hope that answers it in some way.
That's amazing. I love that, having your own literary canon, and also it coming full circle. I guess you having your place in that. Mannerism's now out,
Yes.
major UK publisher. So maybe just to end, tell us a little about the book and what you've got coming up.
So with mannerism, it's literally just off the back of just what I was just talking about now, is the idea that with all of these different crafts, knowledge along the way, how do I now write something that depicts a story that I wanted to tell? And I really wanted to explore the journeys and these stories of black men and boys. I wanted to explore code switching and what that means. I wanted to explore the idea of belonging to one's manner, and the survival tactics along the ways in the mannerisms that they have gone through and grown with, that I've gone through and grown with. Um, and I look into this in a variety of different ways. I look into it in relation to grief in the third section of the book, the a story of myself and my cousin and having lost um, a high figure in the family. I explore it through art history, drawing parallels to painter Caravaggio, to look into the parallels of power and bias, and how these different goalposts are shifting through centuries, so to speak, or through time. Um, and I draw comparisons to colloquialisms within my own culture, within my own background, with my friends, and with experiences in work, for example, and in popular culture, and all of it makes for good reading, if I'm saying that. And especially it speaks more so because it's a voice that I feel very confident in. It's a voice that I've kind of worked on over time with the knowledge of the many writers that I've read over time as well.
Incredible. Well, thank you so much, Yomi Sode, for joining us. Everybody watching, go get Mannerism. Head to bristolideas.co.uk to read People Watching, Yomi's response to The Wasteland. Thanks for joining us, man. Hope you have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.